The winter night in the suburbs of London was colder than usual. The clock on the wall in the Midnight Brew Café showed 2:47 a.m., its dim fluorescent light casting a weary, harsh glow on the chipped dark tile floor, creating a tired and unforgiving atmosphere. The scent of burnt coffee mixed with bleach clung to the air, chilling to the bone for anyone who had worked here long enough. Elena Marquez stood behind the counter. Her calloused hands kept scrubbing a glass cup that was already spotless. She didn't do it because it wasn't clean enough, but because if she stopped, she'd have to confront the heavy drowsiness weighing down her eyelids. Elena was only 34 but looked more than a decade older. Her angular face and sunken eyes bore the marks of countless night shifts. She was a single mother, carrying the burden of her 9-year-old daughter, Isabella. The shabby rented room on the 4th floor of an East End apartment was always damp and suffocating, but to Elena, it was her only home. Every meager paycheck from the cafe barely covered rent, food, and Isabella's day school fees. She constantly reminded herself, things will improve with a bit more effort, a few more night shifts, and things will improve. Outside, the night mist covered the cafe's glass windows. The streets were silent, broken only by the occasional taxi picking up drunk customers. Elena glanced around. The cafe was empty. At this hour, the regulars were usually tired, drivers needing a strong black coffee, or students nodding off over unfinished essays. But tonight was unusually quiet, so much so that the clock ticking could be heard clearly. Elena sighed and leaned against the counter. Her thoughts drifted to Isabella, curled in a thin blanket in their cold room. She recalled her daughter studying under the weak yellow light, lips murmuring English words that were hard to pronounce. "I won't let you live as I do," Elena silently vowed. That promise was the only fuel keeping her upright whenever she felt like collapsing. Just then, the bell above the door rang a crisp ding that sliced through the silence. Elena flinched and turned around. The person who entered wasn't a familiar face. Standing before her was a boy around 11 years old, small-framed in a thick navy blue coat. In his hand was a white cane, its tip tapping across the tiled floor. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, unable to see the light around him. Elena held her breath. This was rare. At this cold, weary hour, a blind boy had walked into her cafe alone, with no adult accompanying him. He stood still for a few seconds, his cane lightly touching a chair leg, before hesitantly speaking in a trembling, uneven voice. Is anyone working here?" Elena quickly set the cup down and came out from behind the counter. "I'm here, don't worry." "What would you like, dear?" Her voice softened, utterly different from the fatigue earlier. The boy tilted his head toward the direction of her voice, lips trembling as if searching for a response. Elena noticed how tightly his hands gripped the cane, slightly shaking as if his small body was trying hard to stay strong. A pang of recognition pierced through Elena, a familiar feeling of being lost and small in a world far too vast and harsh. That night's story began just like that, in a moment that seemed ordinary, but was powerful enough to change Elena's life forever. Elena pulled out a chair for the boy to sit in a corner near the counter, where the yellow light was softer and the cold wind seeping through the door couldn't reach. She placed a cup of hot chocolate in front of him, steam gently rising, the scent of cocoa spreading through a space that had until now only smelled of burnt coffee. The boy slightly raised his nose, as if recognizing the scent, then gave a faint smile. "Drink it before it gets cold," Elena said, her voice as gentle as when she soothed Isabella during a difficult homework session. His thin hands carefully felt around, searching for the cup's rim. When his fingers touched the warm ceramic, he paused, exhaling the breath he had been holding. A small sip. A brief moment of peace. Elena watched him, her heart full of questions. "Why are you out on your own at this hour? Where are your parents?" The boy remained silent. A few seconds passed, broken only by the soft clinking of a spoon stirring the chocolate. Then he answered, in a voice so quiet that Elena had to lean in to hear. "They don't care. They think I'm just a burden. Dad said if I can't be the perfect son, then it's best if I disappear into some boarding school." Elena froze. Colder than the winter wind, those words fell into her ears like sharp blades. For a moment, she saw herself at 13 kicked out by her father for being pregnant out of wedlock, wandering the streets of Madrid on a winter night, with no one to defend her. That feeling of being treated like disposable trash. Elena knew it in her very bones. "What's your name?" she asked, voice steady, though it took effort. Adrian. The name echoed, clean and lonely in the air. The boy still sat upright, trying to appear strong, but his hand gripped the white cane across his lap so tightly that Elena could see the veins bulging beneath his thin skin. Adrian, she repeated softly, wanting to remember it. Then, unable to hold back, she asked, have you tried telling anyone? A teacher? A friend? Or... Adrian let out a laugh, but it was the kind that choked halfway through. Who would care? People see me as the blind, useless kid, bad at everything. They look at me and shake their heads. I hear it all. That innocent yet world-weary statement froze time for Elena. She wanted to reach out and hold him, but stopped herself. Some wounds were too deep to be soothed with a hasty gesture. Elena drew a deep breath, then said, each word etched into the air. You're not useless, Adrian. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who sees you. Just one. That's enough. Adrian turned his head toward that voice. His eyes behind the dark glasses remained unmoving, but his face trembled slightly. A tiny tear, whether from the heat of the chocolate or the unexpected words, slid gently onto his frail hand. Outside the window, the fog had thickened, obscuring the cold, indifferent buildings of the city. But in the small corner of that café, Elena knew something had just begun to change. Not just for Adrian, but for herself, a woman who had long thought hope was beyond her reach. The next morning, the little café opened as usual. Elena busied herself wiping the counter and making coffee for a few early regulars on their way to work. But her mind kept drifting back to the image of the boy from last night, his trembling hands holding the cup of hot chocolate, his voice as soft as the wind slipping past her ears. Who would care? As the customer flow thinned, the cafe door opened again near noon. Adrian appeared this time, walking more slowly, more cautiously, as if afraid someone might chase him away. His white cane tapped lightly on the worn tile floor. Elena smiled in greeting. Adrian, you've come back. I just made some pastries. Would you like to try one? The boy stopped, a little confused. Adrian wasn't used to someone remembering his name. After a few seconds of hesitation, he gave a slight nod. Elena pulled out the familiar wooden chair and placed a pastry and a glass of warm milk before him. The boy sat down, his hands touching the table's edge to get his bearings, then slowly reaching for the plate. His movements were jerky and clumsy, but to Elena, they were full of the strength that came from persistence. Did you go to school today? Elena asked casually, like an everyday conversation. Adrian stayed silent for a long while. Finally, he replied, I stayed home. The teacher said I was slowing the class down. Dad agreed. They're getting ready to send me away. Send you where? A boarding school for kids like me. Dad said it'd be less embarrassing for the family that way. Elena felt a surge of bitter heat rise in her chest. After years working in the homes of the wealthy, she knew they could buy everything except patience. Adrian didn't need to be sent away. He needed a different pair of eyes to see his true worth. She looked at Adrian and remembered her past. At 14, a teacher once scolded her in front of the class for reading more slowly than the others. No one knew she had astigmatism and no one cared. Only her mother, an illiterate woman who never gave up on her daughter, taught her letters by tracing shapes into her palm. That was how Elena made it through, slowly, with stumbles. She placed her hand on the table and spoke softly. Adrian, would you like me to try a different way? Not the way teachers or your parents force it on you. A slower way, but easier to breathe with. The boy looked up. Though his eyes could not see, Elena could feel a faint glimmer of hope spark from him. What way? Elena grabbed a napkin and slowly drew a circle with her fingertip. When I was learning, my mother didn't make me read immediately. She let me draw shapes so that letters didn't feel scary. The letter A is just a small circle. Want to try? Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing against the shaky lines Elena had traced. He was quiet for a few seconds, then let out a soft laugh, the first clear smile Elena had seen from him. Like a game? Exactly. Elena nodded. A game you're going to win. In that moment, Elena knew her decision was clear. She couldn't let Adrian be buried under the label of useless that his father had forced on him. She would be the one to stand up just as her mother once did for her. In the corner of the worn-down café, amidst the scent of coffee and the wind brushing past the windows, a silent bond began to form, something Adrian had never believed he could have, someone who truly saw him. In the days that followed, Elena's small café became a quiet refuge for Adrian. No one in the marble mansion knew that the boy often slipped out each afternoon, escaping his father's harsh gaze and the whispers of the household staff. Sometimes he strolled, tapping each cobblestone on the old street with his cane. Other times he asked a familiar driver to drop him off nearby and walked the rest. To Adrian, it felt like a small prison break, and the reward was sitting in a warm room, hearing the soft clink of coffee cups and Elena's calming, low voice. Elena had begun their letter game. At first, it was just clumsy circles on napkins, then simple curves, then letters transformed into drawings. The letter A became a circle with a little tail. It looked like a stick with a ball hanging beside it. Each time Adrian traced the shape, he smiled a strange little smile, part curiosity, part joy. "So letters aren't as scary as I thought," he whispered. Elena nodded, her gaze gentle. "Never scary, not if you learn in your way." Time passed. Each afternoon, they sat by the wooden table near the window, with the golden late-day sunlight streaming like a soft curtain. Gradually, Adrian stopped fearing books. He began reading short words, then putting them together into sentences, still slow, still muddled at times, but progressing. And every time he stumbled, Elena never scolded. She waited patiently, as if time itself no longer mattered. But peace never lasts forever. One evening, when Adrian returned home, Mr. Laurent was already seated in the parlor. In his hand was an envelope, a school report. The billionaire, with graying hair and a perfectly pressed suit, spoke with a voice cold as steel, echoing through the room. "My son, today I received yet another complaint. The teacher says, you've made no progress. I've spent countless hours on specialists, and still the result is 0. Adrian bowed his head, his small hands clenched. But this time, he didn't stay silent. In his mind, Elena's words echoed. "You're not useless. You have your rhythm." I'm trying," Adrian whispered, voice trembling but full of determination. Laurent raised an eyebrow. "Trying? I don't need effort, I need results. I'm sending you to Saint Gregoire boarding school in Lyon. They know how to deal with lazy children." At the mention of Saint Gregoire, Adrian shuddered. It was a notoriously harsh school, where children were forced into iron discipline. To him, it was no different from a prison. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed, fingers feeling through the pages of the book Elena had given him, trying to reread the lines. But the harder he tried, the more the letters twisted and danced before his eyes. Tears fell, dropping onto the page. "Maybe Father's right," he thought. "Maybe I am useless." The next morning, Adrian arrived at the café exhausted. Elena immediately noticed the puffiness around his eyes and the drained look on his face. She didn't ask right away. Instead, she quietly poured him a warm glass of milk and set down a small piece of pastry. When the boy picked up the glass, Elena finally spoke, gently. "Adrian, what happened last night?" His voice cracked. "Father's sending me to Saint Gregoire. I'm so scared, Miss Elena. They'll crush me, just like he wants." Elena fell silent. Memories surged back. Years ago, in her hometown of Seville, she too had been threatened, told she'd be sent to a reformatory if she didn't become normal like the others. But her mother fought back, kept her home, and patiently found a way for her to learn. "Adrian," she placed her hand on his, her voice firm, "you are not useless. You need someone who won't abandon you halfway. If your father can't do that, then I will." The boy looked up. His eyes, clouded by a congenital condition, couldn't see, but Elena saw it clearly. A tiny spark of light flickered inside. Why do you care about me?" he asked. "I'm just a boy people look down on." Elena smiled, her eyes slightly blurred by tears. "Because I used to be that child too, and someone saved me. Now it's my turn to save you." Outside the café, church bells echoed through the old street. In that moment, an invisible promise was made. A promise that Elena knew would soon bring her face to face with the storm named Laurent. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Laurent's mansion became tenser than ever. Laurent started paying attention to Adrian's every move, unable to comprehend why the boy who used to hang his head in defeat over failed tests now appeared calmer, even with a rare flicker of light in his eyes. To a man used to controlling everything like Laurent, that change was nothing short of a potential threat. During one dinner, he sat at the head of the long table, the clinking of knife and fork against porcelain echoing coldly. Adrian sat a few seats away, head slightly bowed, but at times he couldn't hide a faint smile when recalling the lessons with Elena at the small café. Laurent noticed that smile, and suspicion flashed in his eyes. "Adrian," his voice was deep and sharp like a blade. "Is there anything unusual going on lately? I've heard you've been going out more." The spoon in the boy's hand froze. Adrian swallowed hard, hesitating. I just went out for a walk, father." "A walk?" Laurent sneered. "My heir has no time for walks. You must study, overcome failure. Don't think I know someone is influencing you." For a moment, Adrian couldn't breathe. He lowered his head, not daring to say more. Laurent didn't yet know Elena's name, but with the instinct of a man seasoned in business, he sensed someone was interfering with his plan. Meanwhile, at the café, Elena also sensed the storm clouds gathering. One afternoon, while she was teaching Adrian how to read a short passage from a children's version of Don Quixote, a man in a gray suit walked in, his eyes scanning the room with a sharp, intrusive gaze. He was Laurent's assistant, known for his cold demeanor. "Young master," he said flatly, "Mr. Laurent wants to know why you've disappeared during tutoring hours. Is something going on here?" Elena kept calm, gently touching Adrian's shoulder to reassure him. "He's just here to read books and drink warm milk. Even a child needs space to breathe, sir." The man's eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade. He said nothing more and turned away, but Elena knew from now on, every step they took would be watched. That evening, when Adrian returned home, Laurent was waiting in the study. The yellow lamplight cast harsh shadows across his stern face. On the desk was a thick folder filled with school reports, notes from tutors who had quit, and whispers about Adrian's appearances at the old town café. "My son," Laurent spoke slowly, "I warned you. I don't want you wasting time on pointless things. Don't let an outsider meddle in your path. Do you understand?" Adrian said nothing. His hand clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout that Elena was not pointless, that only she truly saw him. But in Laurent's eyes, he saw only a wall of cold steel where emotions were crushed. That night, Adrian wrote a small note and hid it inside a book he brought to the café. "Miss Elena, my father knows. He could take me away at any moment. But I don't want to give up. Please keep helping me, even if there's little time left." When Elena read those clumsy words, her throat tightened. She knew she was walking a tightrope with a deep abyss below. To confront a man like Laurent was to risk destroying the fragile peace she had. But then she remembered her mother, and those days when the woman had taught her each letter with tireless patience. And Elena understood. If she stayed silent now, Adrian would be entirely swallowed by his father's shadow. The next afternoon, when Adrian arrived, Elena placed a hand on the table and looked straight at him. "We will continue, Adrian. No matter what your father does, you must never believe you're useless. Do you hear me?" The boy nodded, his eyes glistening as if he had just received a tiny light in darkness. Outside, the sky over Paris turned to ash gray. The real storm was approaching, and Elena knew that soon the battle would no longer be about letters on a page, but about confronting a man who possessed an empire's power and a cold heart. The morning in Paris was gloomy, with faint rays of sunlight shining through the massive glass windows of the Laurent mansion. The air in the dining room was so heavy that even the sound of spoon and fork clinking against porcelain plates rang out sharply. Adrian sat still, trying to swallow bread bites, but his heart was in turmoil. He knew something big was going to happen today. Laurent had discovered too much. He was no longer just suspicious, he wanted confirmation, and to stop any out-of-control influence over his son. And the clearest target was Elena. That afternoon, when only a few customers lingered in the small café, the door burst open. Laurent stepped in tall, imposing, wearing a long black coat draping past his knees. His shoes struck the wooden floor with echoing steps, drawing every gaze in the room. Adrian sat at the table with Elena, heart pounding, hands clutching his notebook so tightly his fingers trembled. "Leave, Adrian." Laurent's voice wasn't loud, but it was laden with authority. "I need to speak with this woman." Elena looked up. She saw those cold eyes, the same ones that had crushed countless opponents in the business world. But this time, he wasn't facing hostile takeovers or boardroom rivals. He was facing a woman armed with patience and compassion. Adrian hesitated. He turned to Elena, his eyes pleading. But Elena only smiled gently and nodded. "Go on, Adrian. Everything's fine." Reluctantly, the boy stood up and left the table. Laurent sat down, removed his gloves, and placed them on the table like opening a negotiation. "You're Elena? Correct?" He enunciated every word. "I know you've interfered with my son's education. You are a servant. You must clean, to tidy, not to teach." Elena did not lower her head. She kept her voice calm. "Mr. Laurent, I only saw a child who needed to be understood. Adrian is not stupid, not useless. He needs a different way to learn, a rhythm that suits him." "Rhythm?" Laurent sneered, as if hearing nonsense. "How much have I spent hiring the best tutors from England, America, and Switzerland? And they all failed. You think a servant like you can achieve what they couldn't?" Elena looked him straight in the eye. "Maybe because they never truly saw your son. They only saw grades. They didn't see a child trapped in a chaotic world of letters. I was once that child, Mr. Laurent, and I understand the helplessness of being looked down on and seen as broken." The words made Laurent pause slightly, but only briefly. He tightened the strap on his gloves again, eyes turning cold. "You have no right to compare. My son is to inherit an empire. He has no time to be weak." Elena leaned forward, her voice lowered. "Precisely because he must inherit an empire, he needs someone to teach him that true worth doesn't come from bright red scores on a report card, but from not giving up. You can force Adrian into a mold, but kill his belief in himself. Do you want a perfect heir in the eyes of the world, but empty in soul, or a son who truly understands his value?" The whole café fell silent. A waiter in the distance even held his breath. For the first time, someone dared speak to Laurent like that. His eyes blinked slightly, as if something deep inside had been touched. But he quickly brushed the emotion aside. He stood up, grabbed his gloves, leaned close to Elena, his voice laced with threat. "You don't know what realm you're stepping into. This is your final warning. Please stay away from my son. Otherwise, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose the tiny bit of stability you're clinging to." And with that, he turned and left, his dark silhouette melting into the cold Paris afternoon. Elena remained seated, a storm rising inside her. Her hand trembled, but her gaze did not shatter. She knew, from then on, things had gone beyond a secret tutoring session. This was a quiet war between the power of wealth and authority and the force of patience and compassion. Outside, Adrian stood behind the stone wall, having heard everything. His heart tightened, part fear, part awe. In his eyes, Elena was no longer just a maid. She was the only person brave enough to face his father, a giant in a world Adrian had never belonged to. And deep down, Adrian knew. From that moment, he was no longer alone. The next day, the Laurent mansion was no longer the peaceful place it usually was. The air was thick, heavy with tension. Rumors spread quickly among the staff. The master had directly confronted Elena at a café. Cautious glances followed her as she entered the kitchen that morning. No one said anything, but every sideways look, every soft clink of a spoon against porcelain, seemed to whisper, "You've crossed the line." Elena didn't respond. She washed her hands, neatly tied back her curly hair, picked up the mop, and went about her shift. But inside, she knew danger was drawing closer. That afternoon, the butler summoned her to Mr. Laurent's study. That room had never been friendly to any servant. The heavy wooden door revealed Laurent standing by the large window, looking out at the garden. His figure was tall and straight, his hand gripping an unlit cigar. "Elena." His voice echoed, without turning his head. "Who do you think you are? A servant. Daring to sit across from me. Talk back. Teach my son your way?" Elena stood still, heart pounding, but her gaze did not lower. "I don't think I'm anyone, Mr. Laurent. I just saw a child who needed to be heard. I didn't ask for your permission because I knew you would say no. But I couldn't turn away when I saw that boy sinking." Laurent turned around. His eyes were sharp, gleaming cold like a blade. He stepped forward slowly, with weight until only a small distance separated them. "Do you know the consequences of challenging me?" He lowered his voice almost a whisper, yet enough to send chills down her spine. "In this city, With just one phone call, I can ensure you have no place, job, or future. Elena swallowed hard, but then something inside her rose. She remembered Adrian's eyes the first time he read a complete sentence, the radiant smile on his face when he said, "I did it." She remembered her childhood nights, her mother holding her hand, patiently guiding each word, pulling her out of the abyss of despair. She raised her head, her voice calm but firm. "You can take away my job, but can't erase what I've planted in your son's heart." Adrian has begun to believe in himself, and that belief, no one can take it away, not even you. The room fell into a deadly silence. Lawrence stared at her, lips tightly pressed. He said nothing more, only raised his hand and signaled to the butler. "Take her out." Immediately. The butler stepped forward, face filled with unease but not daring to protest. Elena was led out of the room, her heart heavy. She knew her fate now hung by a thread. But in her eyes, there was no fear, only determination. Adrian stood hidden behind a curtain on the other side of the hallway, having witnessed everything. He trembled, tears welling up. But in that moment, a small flame flickered in his chest. Elena had dared to face his father for him. And now, he too had to do something. As the mansion fell into silence that night, Adrian sat at his desk, the yellow light casting shadows on his young but resolute face. He pulled out his notebook and slowly wrote each word, not perfectly, still trembling, but with steadfast resolve. "I am not useless. I will prove it to everyone." Elena sat in her small room in a quiet corner of the mansion, clutching her mother's old handkerchief. She didn't know if she would still be here tomorrow, but she knew the real battle was only beginning. The sky over Geneva the next morning was gray, with heavy clouds pressing down on the city. Inside the Laurent mansion, the atmosphere was just as heavy. News of Elena being reprimanded and at risk of dismissal had spread quickly. Staff worked quietly, avoiding mention of her name, afraid of bringing trouble upon themselves. But in Adrian's heart, it only fueled his determination. That 2-year-old boy, once timid, used to enduring, was now different. The night before, when he wrote the words, "I will prove it to everyone," Adrian had made a decision. If Elena was being punished just for teaching him to see letters in his rhythm, then he would show the world, especially his father, the undeniable truth. That morning, Adrian woke earlier than usual. He sat at his desk, the book still open. His hands trembled, but he took a deep breath and began to read. Each word was mouthed slowly, each syllable like a heavy stone to lift. At times, the letters danced before his eyes, but he remembered Elena's words. "They don't hate you, Adrian, they just dance to a different beat. Let them sing in your way." Just then, a knock on the door. The housekeeper was carrying out the study schedule prepared by Mr. Laurent for the day. "Young master, a new tutor from Zurich will be arriving today. Monsieur Laurent has arranged it." Adrian clenched the notebook in his hand, his eyes flashing with rare defiance. "I don't need a tutor anymore." The housekeeper froze, never having heard him speak so firmly. "But young master, this is your father's order." Adrian didn't answer. He stood up abruptly, holding the notebook tight, and ran out of the room, leaving the housekeeper calling after him. He went to Elena's small room at the far end of the staff corridor. He knocked, breathless. Elena opened the door with dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. "Adrian, why are you here?" He held out his notebook, flipping to the page he had written. The letters were still clumsy, uneven in size, but clear. "I am not useless." Elena bit her lip, eyes glistening. The boy whispered, "You took a risk for me. Now I'll take one for you." I'm going to read it to him. In front of everyone. That evening, in the grand dining hall, as Mr. Laurent hosted guests, a few Swiss investors and 2 foreign dignitaries, Adrian unexpectedly entered. No one had called him, but his footsteps echoed across the polished wooden floor. "Father." His voice trembled, but was clear. All eyes in the room turned toward him. Laurent frowned. "Adrian, not now. Leave." But the boy shook his head and stepped forward. His hands shook, but he opened the notebook. "I want to read. Right now." An awkward silence fell. One of the guests offered a polite, uncertain smile, thinking this was just a childish interruption. But then Adrian began. "I am not useless." Each word was halting, sometimes off rhythm, but his voice rang out through the grand room. The first guest raised an eyebrow. The second gently set down his wineglass. Laurent went rigid. He had never seen his son dare defy him, in front of others, much less stand and read aloud with such resolve. When Adrian stopped, his face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes shone brightly. I did it because of Elena. Everyone turned to look at Elena, standing with the other servants at the edge of the room. She froze, not expecting Adrian to call her name so openly. A ripple of murmurs spread across the dining table. Laurent clenched his fists, his face frozen in icy silence. But this time no one laughed. No one dared to call Adrian useless again. In the astonished eyes of the guests, the boy had planted a seed that could not be taken back, the seed of truth. Elena's heart pounded. She knew a storm was coming for her. But when Adrian's gaze met hers, full of trust, she understood that now, there was no turning back. The atmosphere in the grand dining room of the Laurent mansion froze when Adrian dared to stand and read aloud. Every guest's eyes were still fixed on the boy and the proud scribbled words in his notebook. But only seconds later, the sound of a fist slamming hard onto the table rang out. Bang! Mr. Laurent's face was taut with fury, his voice gravelly and chilling. Enough! Adrian, what do you think you're doing? You've humiliated me in front of my guests. The room shuddered. Some guests quickly bowed their heads, pretending to focus on their wine glasses to avoid the tension. But an older woman, the wife of a politician, couldn't help but murmur, "The boy, he just read, didn't he?" Her words were like a dagger piercing the icy wall Laurent had built around himself. He paused briefly but immediately brushed it off as if he hadn't heard. He spun sharply toward the corner of the room, where Elena still stood silent, her hand tightly gripping a cleaning cloth. "And you," Laurent practically roared, "a maid, dares to interfere with my son's education and disgrace me in front of my guests. You're out of this house tomorrow." A murmur swept through the room. Some staff members dropped their eyes. Others glanced at Elena with pity. But Elena, though her heart ached, stood tall. Her eyes turned to Adrian. Adrian stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "No. If she goes, then I'll go too. I'd rather be sent to boarding school than stay without Miss Elena." The room fell utterly silent. Only the crackling of the fireplace could be heard. Those words were not just defiance, they were the first crack in the wall of Laurent's authority. A guest, an elderly professor from Lausanne, gently pushed back his chair and spoke in a calm voice. "Monsieur Laurent, I've taught thousands of students. This child is not stupid. He needs someone patient enough to understand him. And clearly, that woman has done what other professionals failed to do." Those words hit Laurent like a bucket of cold water. He looked around the table and noticed several quiet, agreeing on glances cast toward Adrian. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He stood up, voice sharp as a blade. "I don't need anyone lecturing me on how to raise my son. This is my house, and I make the decisions." He signaled to the butler, "Escort her out immediately. As for Adrian, starting tomorrow, you'll be sent to St. Moritz Academy. There, they'll teach you real discipline." Adrian's face went pale. To him, St. Moritz felt like a sentence to exile. But before he could respond, Elena spoke, her voice low but unwavering. "Monsieur Laurent, you can dismiss me, but the truth remains. Your son is not useless. You may deny me, but you cannot deny your eyes." You saw Adrian read. Her words echoed not only through the room, but into the hearts of everyone present. Laurent clenched his fists, his eyes flickering, a flicker of inner conflict he hadn't fully recognized. The storm had truly erupted within the Laurent mansion, and Adrian's eyes shone amidst that storm, brighter and more resolute than ever. The next morning, the Laurent mansion was shrouded in silence, starkly contrasting its usual bustle. Adrian sat curled by the window, gazing at the distant snow-covered Alps. The same notebook from yesterday was in his hands, the page filled with clumsy but vibrant lines. Each word, to him, was more than a lesson. It was proof that he was not useless as his father once claimed. Downstairs in the sitting room, Elena was ready to leave. Her old leather bag rested by her feet, and her hand was clenched so tightly it turned pale. The servants watched her quietly, some with sadness, others with fear. Everyone knew that it was never returned once Mr. Laurent gave an order. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Adrian dashed down the stairs, breathless. "Father," he shouted, "please don't fire her. I'm begging you." Mr. Laurent appeared at the end of the hallway, tall in his pristine suit, his gaze ice cold. Adrian, go to your room. You'll be leaving by the weekend. We've made our decision. But this time, Adrian didn't back down. He stood firmly in the exit path, his small hands gripping the notebook tightly. He opened to the same page he had read the day before, his voice trembling but determined. I'll reread it. If you still think I'm useless. The room went still. Everyone held their breath. Adrian began reading slowly, word by word, not perfectly but clearly. The words rolled off his tongue, no longer stumbling. His blue eyes lit up under the sunlight streaming through the window. Elena stood there, eyes blurry, but she didn't dare interrupt. Mr. Laurent, for the first time, said nothing. His hand trembled slightly. The image of his small but determined son, standing up to him in front of everyone, speaking with his effort, was like a blade cutting through the frozen walls around his heart. He took a deep breath and softly spoke. You did it. Adrian lifted his head. I did it. Because of Miss Elena. No one else believed in me. A long pause followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Laurent's hand slowly relaxed. He turned to the butler and said in a low voice, "Cancel the dismissal. And cancel the plan to send the boy to St. Moritz." The room erupted in whispers. The servants looked up in shock, barely believing their ears. Elena clutched her hands, her chest tight, but her eyes glowed silently. Mr. Laurent walked closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture was awkward, unnatural, but for the first time, Adrian felt the warmth of his father's touch. Son, I was wrong. I thought strength came from discipline and achievement, but today, you taught me that true strength comes from belief. Elena turned away, hiding the tear sliding down her cheek. From that day on, the atmosphere in the Laurent mansion changed. Adrian was no longer called useless. His test papers, now with A's and B's, were neatly pinned to his wall, each cherished like a treasure. Elena was no longer just a maid. She was officially appointed as Adrian's tutor, and laughter slowly filled the hallways once known only for cold, echoing footsteps. As for Mr. Laurent, a man who once believed that money could buy anything, he finally learned a lesson no business school could teach. Wisdom does not flourish under pressure, but grows through patience and compassion. And at the center of it all was a 1-2-year-old boy once labeled useless, now standing tall, his eyes glowing with clarity. Because now, he knew he was never broken. He had only needed someone patient enough to see the light within.